Here's the question you should be asking right now, and that almost nobody in the mainstream coverage is asking directly. How does a ceasefire hold when one of the parties that signed it is not actually the party that controls the decision to honor it? That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a forensic description of the structural problem at the center of the Lebanon ceasefire. The Lebanese government signed. UNIFIL agreed to monitor. The international community celebrated 24 hours of quiet. And Hezbollah, the organization whose military capacity is the entire reason this ceasefire was necessary, made a series of public statements before the ink was dry that amount to a precise roadmap of which provisions it intends to ignore and why. But the question that the coverage is not following is the one behind that question. Who told Hezbollah to say that?
Because Hezbollah does not make strategic communications decisions in isolation. There is an invisible chain running from Beirut's southern suburbs to Tehran, a chain of command, of funding, of strategic instruction. That is the actual architecture this ceasefire was negotiated against. And understanding that chain tells you everything you need to know about why this framework was structurally broken before it started.
I have spent years reconstructing how proxy relationships function as command and control architectures. Not the simplified version in which a state patron pulls strings and a non-state actor follows, but the more complex documented reality in which strategic alignment, financial dependency, and ideological commitment create an invisible chain that shapes decisions without requiring explicit orders. Hezbollah is the most extensively documented case of this architecture in the modern era. What the forensic record shows about the Iran-Hezbollah chain is more operationally precise and more institutionally embedded than the coverage suggests. Tonight I want to show you exactly what that chain looks like, and why it makes this ceasefire structurally unenforceable. One sentence. The Lebanon ceasefire is structurally broken, not because Hezbollah is irrational or undisciplined, but because the invisible chain connecting Hezbollah's military posture to Iranian strategic direction has not been addressed, cannot be addressed by any framework that excludes Tehran as a party, and will not permit Hezbollah to honor provisions that conflict with Iran's current regional priorities. Regardless of what any Lebanese government signs, start with the document. The ceasefire framework, brokered with French and American involvement, anchored to UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which has nominally governed southern Lebanon since 2006, requires several things from Hezbollah specifically: withdrawal of armed forces north of the Litani River, disarmament of heavy weapons in the buffer zone, and cessation of offensive military activity against Israeli territory. Resolution 1701 required exactly the same things in 2006. It has never been fully implemented. 18 years of UNIFIL presence in southern Lebanon have not produced Hezbollah's withdrawal north of the Litani.
The heavy weapons that were supposed to be absent from the buffer zone are documented by Israeli, American, and independent intelligence assessments to have proliferated substantially over that same period. The framework being described as a new agreement is, forensically, a renegotiation of an agreement that was never honored the first time, and the structural reasons it was not honored then are identical to the structural reasons it will not be honored now. Hezbollah's public statements since the ceasefire was announced have been precise rather than vague. Its spokespeople have not said they reject the ceasefire. They have said they reserve the right to respond to what they describe as Israeli violations, that they do not recognize certain monitoring provisions as legitimate, and that their military posture in southern Lebanon reflects defensive necessity rather than offensive intent, a framing that creates a definitional escape from every enforcement mechanism in the agreement.
Now follow the invisible chain. The mainstream coverage describes Hezbollah as an Iranian proxy, which is accurate but insufficient. The word proxy implies a relationship of simple instruction. Tehran tells Hezbollah what to do. Hezbollah does it. The forensic record shows something more structurally embedded and therefore more durable. The Iran-Hezbollah relationship operates through at least 3 distinct channels simultaneously. The first is financial. Iran provides Hezbollah with an estimated $700 million to $1 billion annually, according to assessments from the U.S. State Department and independent researchers at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. That funding flows through the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, specifically its Quds Force, and sustains Hezbollah's social services network, its military logistics, and its political infrastructure in Lebanon.
Financial dependency of that magnitude does not require explicit orders. It creates structural alignment through the simple logic of what happens if the funding stops. The second channel is military-technical. Iran supplies Hezbollah with weapons, training, and operational doctrine through a supply chain that has been documented by UNIFIL, Israeli intelligence, and U.S. assessments to run through Syrian territory and, increasingly, through maritime routes. The precision-guided munitions that Hezbollah has developed over the past decade, the capability that makes it strategically significant rather than merely a guerrilla force, are Iranian-designed, Iranian-supplied, and in some cases, Iranian-operated. The chain connecting Tehran's military-industrial complex to Hezbollah's weapons depots in southern Lebanon is not metaphorical. It is a physical logistics network. The third channel is ideological-political. Hezbollah was founded in 1982 under direct Iranian Revolutionary Guard sponsorship, is organizationally committed to the principle of velayat-e-faqih, the doctrine of clerical governance associated with Iran's supreme leadership, and has embedded Iranian strategic priorities into its organizational identity in a way that survives leadership changes and operational setbacks. When Hezbollah's Secretary General says something about the group's post-ceasefire posture, the question that matters is not what he said. It is what strategic calculation that statement reflects, and who that calculation serves.
Here is what the mainstream coverage is not saying. Iran's current strategic interest is not for Hezbollah to honor this ceasefire. It is for Hezbollah to use this ceasefire. Those are different instructions, and they produce different behavior. Iran's regional position has been significantly stressed by the events of the past 18 months. The strikes on Iranian nuclear infrastructure, the degradation of Hamas's military capacity in Gaza, the pressure on Houthi supply lines in Yemen, Tehran's network of non-state partners has absorbed significant damage. What Iran needs right now is time, not peace. Time. Time to reconstitute Hezbollah's weapons stocks, rebuild its precision munitions inventory, repair its logistics networks through Syria, and restore the deterrence architecture that was the primary strategic purpose of the Hezbollah relationship in the first place. A ceasefire that holds gives Iran exactly that time. A ceasefire that Hezbollah visibly violates gives Israel a pretext for resuming operations that further degrade the network Iran is trying to rebuild. So the invisible chain instruction from Tehran, forensically inferred from the pattern of Hezbollah's public statements, is precise. Honor enough of the ceasefire to prevent Israeli military resumption, but reserve enough operational freedom to continue the reconstitution work that cannot wait for a permanent settlement that will never come. That instruction, honor it enough, reserve enough, is structurally incompatible with the ceasefire framework's actual requirements. It is also the rational behavior of a party whose strategic objectives cannot be achieved through the agreement it just nominally accepted. This is not cynicism. This is the forensic reading of what the invisible chain produces when its interests and the ceasefire's requirements are in direct conflict.
Now look at the other signatory, the Lebanese state. Lebanon's government signed this ceasefire agreement as if it has the capacity to enforce it. The forensic record of Lebanese state authority over its own territory suggests otherwise, in ways that the coverage consistently softens. Hezbollah controls approximately 30% of Lebanon's parliament, runs a parallel social services infrastructure that functions as a state within the state in significant portions of southern Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley, and has historically operated its military wing entirely outside Lebanese Armed Forces command authority. The Lebanese army has never been given, and has never claimed, the mandate or the capability to disarm Hezbollah. UN Security Council Resolution 1559, passed in 2004, required exactly that disarmament. It was not implemented. Resolution 1701, passed in 2006, required essentially the same thing. It was not implemented. When the Lebanese government signs a ceasefire that requires Hezbollah's compliance, it is signing a document it has no mechanism to enforce. This is not a criticism of the Lebanese government specifically. It is a description of a structural reality that every party to the negotiation understands and that none of them will say publicly. The international community needs a Lebanese signatory to give the agreement legal standing. Lebanon needs international support to maintain economic and political viability. So the signature happens, the framework is announced, and the structural impossibility of enforcement is managed through the diplomatic language of ongoing monitoring and implementation review.
UNIFIL, the UN interim force in Lebanon, has been present in southern Lebanon since 1978. That is 48 years of interim presence. The word interim has rarely been used more inaccurately in international relations. UNIFIL's mandate, expanded under Resolution 1701, requires it to support the Lebanese armed forces in ensuring that southern Lebanon is free of armed groups other than the Lebanese state. In practice, UNIFIL's actual operational capability to enforce that mandate against a militarily sophisticated actor like Hezbollah is close to zero. UNIFIL cannot conduct offensive operations. It cannot compel Hezbollah to disarm.
It cannot search private property without Lebanese army cooperation that the Lebanese army is not in a position to provide. What UNIFIL can do is observe, report, and document violations, which it has done extensively over 18 years, producing detailed reports of Hezbollah military activity in the buffer zone that have had no discernible effect on Hezbollah's behavior because there is no enforcement mechanism attached to the documentation. The ceasefire monitoring architecture being described in the current framework adds international observers to a UNIFIL presence that already exists and already cannot enforce the requirements it is supposed to monitor. Adding observers to an unenforceable framework does not make it enforceable. It makes it more extensively documented in its failure. For a skeptic watching institutional responses to repeated institutional failure, this is the pattern that produces the most justified frustration. The same tools, reapplied to the same problem, producing the same result, announced each time as a meaningful new commitment.
So what did 24 hours of quiet actually mean? Forensically, it meant that neither party found it strategically useful to violate the ceasefire in the first 24 hours. That is not the same as either party intending to honor it. The first 24 hours of a ceasefire are almost always quiet. Both sides are repositioning, assessing, and managing their international optics. The forensic question is not what happened in hour 1. It is what happens in week 3, when the cameras have moved on, and the invisible chain has had time to assess what the operational environment allows.
Pause. The 24-hour headline serves a specific function in international diplomatic theater. It creates a window in which political capital can be claimed, a framework can be endorsed, and the narrative of progress can be established before the structural problems reassert themselves. Every party to this process, the French, the Americans, the Lebanese government, the UN, has an interest in the 24-hour success story. None of them has a mechanism to extend that story beyond the point where Hezbollah's strategic calculus and Iran's invisible chain instruction make maintaining it inconvenient.
Every actor in this architecture faces a version of the same impossible position. Lebanon's government must sign agreements it cannot enforce or lose international support it cannot survive without. UNIFIL must monitor provisions it has no tools to enforce or lose the mandate that justifies its presence. France and the United States must sponsor frameworks they know are structurally insufficient or accept that the alternative, doing nothing, produces worse optics and worse outcomes in the short term. Israel must decide at what threshold of Hezbollah violation it resumes operations, knowing that resuming operations will be condemned internationally and that not resuming them allows the reconstitution that makes the next round more dangerous.
Size, and Hezbollah must manage the tension between Tehran's instruction to use the ceasefire for reconstitution and the operational reality that visible violations create Israeli military responses that disrupt the reconstitution. The invisible chain does not eliminate Hezbollah's agency. It constrains it within a strategic corridor defined by Iranian priorities. Within that corridor, Hezbollah is making rational calculations about what it can do, how visibly, and for how long before the cost exceeds the benefit. 24 hours of quiet is the opening move of that calculation, not its conclusion. Scenario 1. Managed erosion. The ceasefire technically holds, meaning no large-scale military exchanges, while Hezbollah systematically restores its weapons depots, repairs its logistics networks, and reconstitutes its precision munitions inventory below the threshold that triggers Israeli military response. The international community processes UNIFIL reports of violations, issues statements of concern, and takes no enforcement action. In 6 to 12 months, Hezbollah's military capability is substantially restored. The ceasefire is declared a success. The next conflict begins from a higher baseline of Hezbollah capability than the last one. Scenario 2. Early collapse. A Hezbollah action, whether deliberate provocation or a local commander's miscalculation, triggers an Israeli military response within weeks. The ceasefire framework is abandoned. International mediators begin working on the next framework. Lebanon's civilian population absorbs the consequences of a breakdown that the Lebanese government had no capacity to prevent. This is the scenario that the 24-hour coverage is designed to make seem less likely than it is. Scenario 3. Genuine implementation, requiring a change in the invisible chain's instruction. This would require Iran to make a strategic decision that Hezbollah's compliance with this ceasefire serves Iranian interests better than its managed non-compliance. That calculation would require a significant shift in Iranian threat perception, possible if the pressure on Iran's nuclear program and regional network reaches a threshold that makes de-escalation more attractive than continued proxy activation. There are currently no signals that Iran has made that calculation. Scenario 4. The Lebanese state uses the ceasefire window to fundamentally restructure its relationship with Hezbollah, either through a political accommodation that integrates Hezbollah's military wing into national defense structures with some accountability, or through a confrontation that asserts state authority in ways that have been avoided for decades. This is the most transformative scenario and the one that requires Lebanese political courage that has not been present in any previous ceasefire period. It cannot be imposed from outside. It can only emerge from inside.
If you are skeptical of the institutional narrative around this ceasefire, your skepticism is forensically grounded. The invisible chain connecting Hezbollah to Tehran has not been addressed. The structural impossibility of Lebanese state enforcement has not been resolved. The UNIFIL monitoring architecture that has documented violations without consequence for 18 years has not been given new tools. The framework that failed in 2006 is being renegotiated without the changes that would be necessary to produce a different result. The frustration this produces, watching the same institutions apply the same tools to the same problem and announce the same progress, is the correct response to a pattern of institutional behavior that prioritizes the appearance of progress over the structural changes that would produce actual progress. It is not cynicism, it is pattern recognition. And the pattern here is extremely well documented.
Understanding the invisible chain does not make the ceasefire worthless. 24 hours of quiet is 24 hours in which people are not dying. Even managed erosion is better than immediate collapse. But understanding the invisible chain does make it impossible to treat the framework as a solution rather than a temporary accommodation of a structural problem that remains fully intact underneath the diplomatic language.
Blockchain J. Close and question. To 90 seconds. Let me bring this together. The Lebanon ceasefire held for 24 hours. Hezbollah said it will not follow provisions it considers illegitimate. The Lebanese government cannot enforce the provisions it signed. UNIFIL cannot enforce what it monitors. And the invisible chain connecting Hezbollah's strategic posture to Iranian direction has not been addressed, was not a party to the negotiation, and will continue to shape Hezbollah's behavior regardless of what any framework document says. The structural failure here is not a failure of diplomacy in the narrow sense. The negotiators did what they could within the constraints of the architecture.
Frustrated. The structural failure is the architecture itself, an international security framework that requires non-state actors to comply with agreements signed by states that do not control them, monitored by forces that cannot enforce them, sponsored by powers that will not absorb the cost of actual enforcement. That architecture has failed in southern Lebanon for 18 consecutive years. The 24-hour headline does not change its underlying geometry. The invisible chain will determine what this ceasefire looks like in week 3, in month 2, in the 6-month review. Not the document, not the monitoring mechanism, not the diplomatic language. The chain between Tehran and Hezbollah's military command is the variable that the entire framework is built around addressing, and the one variable that the framework has no mechanism to reach. Here is the question I want to leave you with. If you could redesign the ceasefire framework from scratch, knowing everything about the invisible chain, the structural enforcement gap, and Iran's strategic calculus, what single change would make it more likely to hold? Leave your answer in the comments. The most structurally rigorous responses I will read in the follow-up.